royal banquet of Alderwick Palace was supposed to be the grandest night of the season. Every noble family in the kingdom had come dressed in silk, velvet, pearls, and pride. Golden chandeliers burned above the ballroom like captured stars. The polished marble floor reflected the glow of 100 candles. Royal musicians played softly from the balcony while dukes, duchesses, barons, and ladies moved through the hall with practiced smiles and poisoned whispers. It was the kind of night where reputations were made and destroyed. Then the palace herald raised his silver staff, and every conversation in the room began to fade. His Grace, Duke Alistar Stirling of Ravenshade. The great doors opened. Alistar entered with his head high, dressed in black and gold, every inch the powerful duke the court respected and feared. But it was not his title that made the room whisper. It was the woman on his arm. Lady Alistar Vance stepped beside him in a gown of pale ivory, smiling as if she had waited her whole life for this moment. She moved through the doorway like a woman already certain of victory. Her hand rested lightly on Alistar's sleeve, but her eyes were fixed on the room, watching the nobles notice her, admire her, accept her. And they did. A few ladies leaned close behind their fans. So the Duke is finally chosen wisely. Another whispered, at last, a woman who suits Ravenshade. Soft laughter moved across the ballroom, not loud enough to be called cruel, but sharp enough to wound anyone who understood what they meant. Because everyone in that room knew Duke Alistar had a wife, a lawful duchess. A woman he had married, hidden, and refused to present before the royal court. Jasmine Vance, the Black Duchess of Ravenshade, was not supposed to be there that night. The court believed she had stayed behind in silence, abandoned in her husband's mansion, while another woman stood in her place. Alistar heard the whispers and did not correct them. Eleanor heard them and smiled wider. For one shining, shameful moment, it looked as if the world had accepted the lie. Then, just as the first dance was about to begin, the palace doors opened again. No herald spoke at first. No title was announced. Only the sound of the doors spreading wide echoed through the ballroom. The music faltered. A violin note trembled and died. One by one, faces turned toward the entrance, and there she stood, Jasmine, alone. She wore a deep royal blue gown that moved around her like midnight water. Her shoulders were straight, her chin was lifted. Her face carried no tears, no pleading, no fear. Against her heart rested a sapphire brooch shaped like a crown lily, glowing beneath the candlelight, with a quiet power that made the oldest nobles in the room stop breathing. Alistar turned, the color drained from his face. Eleanor's smile vanished so quickly it was as if someone had pulled a mask from her skin. The same women who had laughed moments earlier lowered their fans. The same men who had whispered about her place suddenly found themselves unable to speak, because Jasmine did not enter like a rejected wife. She entered like a woman who had remembered her name, and somewhere near the royal table, Chancellor Clement Willoughby rose slowly from his chair. That single movement changed everything. For a man like Clement did not stand for beauty. He did not stand for scandal. He stood for bloodline, for history, for truth. And as Jasmine took her first step into the ballroom, every candle seemed to burn brighter, every whisper seemed to shrink, and every guilty heart in that palace began to understand one terrible thing. The Duke had not hidden his wife because she was unworthy. He had hidden her because he was afraid of what the world would see when she finally stepped into the light. That night, Alistar Stirling brought another woman to the royal banquet, because he was ashamed of his Black Duchess. But before the final dance ended, his wife would steal the night, expose the lie, and make every noble who mocked her lower their eyes in shame. If stories of betrayal, hidden secrets, romance, royal shame, and powerful women rising from heartbreak touch your heart, then subscribe and join this family. Because tonight's story is not just about a duchess who was rejected. It is about the night she walked back into the light. Now let's begin. Earlier that same day, far from the golden lights of Alderwick Palace, Ravenshade Manor was already awake with the sound of preparation. Servants moved quickly through the long corridors, carrying polished silver trays, folded linens, boxes of pearls, and gowns wrapped carefully in white cloth. Footmen hurried across the courtyard to inspect the black carriage waiting near the front steps. Stable boys brushed the horses until their coats shone. Maids whispered in corners, then fell silent whenever someone important passed by. Every room carried the same excitement. The Duke was going to the royal banquet. The house of Ravenshade would be seen before the crown. And yet, in the west wing of the manor, one woman stood untouched by all that attention. Jasmine Vance, the lawful Duchess of Ravenshade, stood beside a tall window with her hands folded gently in front of her. Morning light rested on her face, soft and pale, but there was no peace in her eyes. From where she stood, she could see the carriage being cleaned, the footmen lining the steps, and the servants carrying one beautiful gown after another through the hall. None of those gowns came to her room. No maid had asked how she wanted her hair arranged. No jeweler had been sent to polish her pieces. No message had arrived from her husband telling her when she was expected to be ready. In that house, everyone was preparing for the royal banquet. Everyone except the Duchess. Jasmine did not shout for answers. She did not storm through the halls demanding respect. That had never been her way. Pain had taught her how to stand still while the world tried to make her feel small. So she remained by the window, watching the house move around her as if she were a portrait on the wall, seen every day, but never truly noticed. Then Mrs. Agnes Rowe entered quietly. The head housekeeper had served Ravenshade Manor for more than 30 years. She knew every secret hidden beneath its polished floors. She knew which rooms held laughter, which rooms held grief, and which rooms had learned to swallow a woman's tears before anyone else could hear them. That morning she carried no gown, no gloves, no invitation, only a sadness she tried and failed to hide. Jasmine did not need many words to understand. She saw it in Agnes's lowered eyes. She saw it in the way the old woman's hands tightened against her apron. She saw it in the silence that entered the room before the truth did. The Duke had not forgotten her. Forgetting would have been kinder. He had remembered her clearly enough to leave her behind. Downstairs, another woman was being prepared to stand where Jasmine should have stood. Another woman would walk into the palace on Alistar Stirling's arm. Another woman would smile beneath the chandeliers, while the court whispered that the Duke had finally corrected the mistake of his marriage. And Jasmine, his wife, his Duchess, the woman who carried his name, was expected to remain hidden inside Ravenshade Manor like an embarrassment, locked behind velvet curtains. For a moment, she lowered her eyes, not because she was weak, but because even a proud heart can ache when it is wounded by the one person who was supposed to protect it. Outside, the carriage wheels gleamed in the morning sun. Inside, the hidden Duchess stood in silence, and with every breath she took, the quiet around her became heavier. Because deep inside Jasmine Vance, something was beginning to change. The woman they expected to stay invisible was finally starting to understand that silence had protected everyone except herself. While Jasmine stood alone in the West Wing, Duke Alistar Stirling stood in the quiet darkness of his private study surrounded by walls of old books, heavy curtains, and portraits of dead Ravenshade men who had all worn the same proud expression. They watched him from their golden frames as if judgment had passed from the living court into the faces of the dead. On the desk before him lay the royal banquet invitation, sealed with the crown's mark. Beside it rested a pair of black gloves, untouched, and a glass of brandy he had poured but never tasted. Alistar had dressed for the evening, but something about him was not settled. His coat was perfect, his boots were polished, his title was secure, yet his eyes kept moving toward the door, as if a part of him expected Jasmine to enter and ask the question he had been avoiding all morning. Then Cavendish Jasper stepped closer to the desk. The royal advisor was not a tall man, but he had the manner of someone who knew how to make powerful men feel cornered. His voice was low, smooth, and careful, the kind of voice that never needed to rise because it carried poison gently. He reminded Alistar that the banquet was not simply music, wine, and royal greetings. It was a battlefield dressed in silk. Every smile would be measured, every handshake would be counted. Every noble family would be watching the woman who stood beside the Duke of Ravenshade. And if that woman was Jasmine, the whispers would begin before the first dance. They would ask why Alistar had married her. They would ask what kind of blood now sat inside the Ravenshade name. They would ask whether the Duke had weakened his house with sentiment. Alistar's jaw tightened. He said Jasmine was his wife. But the words came out too softly to sound like a defense. Cavendish noticed. That was the weakness he had come to press. He moved toward the fireplace, watching the flames bend and rise. Then he told Alistar that no one was asking him to deny the marriage inside his home. No one was asking him to cast the Duchess into the street. All he needed to do was understand the difference between private loyalty and public power. Lady Eleanor Vance, he said, was admired by the old families. She knew the royal language, she knew when to smile, when to bow, when to flatter, and when to remain silent. She would calm the court. She would strengthen Alistar's image. She would give the nobles a woman they could accept without question. Alistar looked toward the invitation again. For one brief moment, his face softened, and Jasmine's image seemed to rise before him. The quiet way she carried pain, the way she never demanded affection, the way she looked at him sometimes, not with anger, but with a sadness that made him feel smaller than he wanted to be. But then Cavendish spoke the words that struck directly at the part of Alistar that feared disgrace. Marriage, he said, belonged behind closed doors. Power belonged in public. The room fell silent after that. Outside the study, the household continued preparing for the banquet. Footsteps moved through the corridors. Carriage wheels scraped against stone. Somewhere below, a woman laughed softly, and Alistar knew it was Eleanor. He should have called for Jasmine then. He should have sent someone to tell his wife to dress. He should have chosen honor before reputation. Instead, he picked up his gloves from the desk and closed his hand around them. And in that small, quiet movement, the Duke of Ravenshade made the choice that would shame him before the entire kingdom before the night was over. By late afternoon, the sky above Ravenshade Manor had turned a soft silver, and the whole estate seemed to hold its breath for the arrival of someone important. The servants knew before the carriage reached the gate. The sound of wheels over gravel carried through the front courtyard, sharp and confident, like a warning dressed as elegance. Footmen hurried toward the entrance. Maids straightened their aprons. Even the candles in the main hall had been lit earlier than usual, as if the house itself had been ordered to pretend this was a joyful day. Then Lady Eleanor Vance arrived. She stepped down from her carriage in a gown of pale ivory silk, the kind of gown that did not need to shout to be noticed. Pearls rested at her throat. Her gloves were spotless. Her dark hair was pinned with silver combs that caught the light each time she moved. Everything about her had been chosen carefully, not just to impress the court, but to remind every watching servant that she had come to take a place that was not hers. She did not enter Ravenshade Manor like a guest. She entered like a woman inspecting a home she expected to inherit. Her eyes moved over the marble floors, the carved staircase, the family portraits, and the tall windows with a quiet satisfaction. She greeted the servants with a smile that looked gentle from a distance, but close enough, it carried no warmth. One maid lowered her head too slowly, and Eleanor's gaze lingered on her just long enough to make the girl tremble. Word of her arrival traveled quickly through the halls. Jasmine heard it before she saw her. The whisper of Eleanor's name passed from one servant to another, soft but impossible to miss. Lady Eleanor had come. Lady Eleanor was dressed for the palace. Lady Eleanor would ride with the Duke. Jasmine stood in the main hall when Eleanor finally appeared. For a brief moment, the two women looked at each other in silence. They were related by blood, but nothing in that hallway felt like family. Eleanor smiled first. It was a beautiful smile, polished enough for the royal court, but Jasmine knew the cruelty beneath it. She had seen that smile at family dinners, in drawing rooms, at gatherings where women used soft voices to leave deep wounds. Eleanor looked at Jasmine's plain dress, then at her uncovered hands, then at the quiet emptiness around her. No jewels, no cloak, no sign that the Duchess of Ravenshade was going anywhere, and Eleanor's smile deepened. She greeted Jasmine as though they were dear cousins meeting by chance, but every word carried a blade beneath the silk. She said it was a pity Jasmine would not be attending, because royal banquets could be difficult for women who were not raised for them. She spoke gently, almost kindly, as if cruelty became less cruel when wrapped in good manners. Then she leaned closer and said that some women were born for royal rooms, while others were only tolerated in them. The hall went still. A footman near the door lowered his eyes. A maid holding folded gloves froze beside the staircase. Mrs. Agnes Grow stood at the edge of the corridor. Her face tight with anger, she dared not speak. Jasmine did not move. She had spent too many years being measured by women like Eleanor to give her the satisfaction of tears. Her heart hurt, yes, but pain had never made her foolish. She looked at Eleanor with a calm that made the other woman's smile falter. Then Jasmine answered quietly. Borrowed attention, she said, did not become ownership. The words were soft, but they struck harder than if she had shouted. Eleanor's eyes sharpened. For the first time since entering the manor, her perfect expression cracked. Only for a heartbeat. Only long enough for Jasmine to see the truth behind the pearls and painted smile. Eleanor was not confident because she was better. She was confident because Alistar had allowed her to believe Jasmine was powerless. Before Eleanor could reply, footsteps sounded from the upper staircase. Both women turned. Duke Alistar Stirling descended slowly, dressed in black evening attire with gold buttons shining beneath the hall lights. He looked every inch the Duke of Ravenshade. Tall, controlled, powerful, and cold enough to make servants straighten as he passed. But when his eyes reached the bottom of the stairs, his steps slowed. There stood Eleanor, dressed for triumph, and there stood Jasmine, his wife, standing empty-handed in the house that carried her title but denied her place. For one painful moment, Alistar saw everything clearly. He saw Eleanor's smile. He saw the servants pretending not to watch. He saw Jasmine's quiet face, the face of a woman who already understood what he had chosen before he found the courage to say it aloud. And guilt passed across his features so quickly that only Jasmine noticed. That small flicker of shame might have meant something if it had changed him. But it did not. Alistar reached the final step. The silence in the hall grew heavy. Jasmine did not ask him to explain. She did not plead to be taken. She simply stood there, giving him one last chance to remember that she was his duchess, his lawful wife, and the woman whose dignity he had sworn to protect before God, family, and crown. Alistar looked at her. Then he turned to Eleanor and offered her his arm. The movement was small, almost polite. But to Jasmine, it felt like the entire manor had watched him place a crown of humiliation on her head. Eleanor accepted his arm with the grace of a woman who believed she had won. Her fingers rested on his sleeve, delicate and possessive, while her eyes slid back to Jasmine with quiet victory. No one spoke, no one needed to. The Duke had made his choice in front of them all. He had not only left Jasmine behind, he had shown every servant, every whispering maid, every watching footman that the Duchess of Ravenshade could be replaced for one night by a woman the court found easier to accept. And as Alistar led Eleanor toward the front doors, Jasmine remained in the hall, still as stone, while something inside her heart broke without making a sound. But it did not break into weakness, it broke into memory, into anger, into the first sharp edge of a decision she had delayed for too long. The front doors of Ravenshade Manor opened, and the cold afternoon air swept into the hall like a warning. Outside, the black carriage waited at the foot of the stone steps. The horses stood restless beneath polished harnesses, their breath rising in pale clouds. Two footmen held the doors open while the driver sat high above, pretending not to notice the silence that had fallen over the household. Alistar led Eleanor forward. Her hand remained on his arm, light but possessive, as if she wanted every servant to remember the sight. She did not look back at Jasmine immediately. She did not need to. Victory had already softened her mouth into a smile. Jasmine followed only as far as the doorway. She did not cross the threshold. She stood beneath the carved arch of her husband's home and watched another woman step into the place that belonged to her. The servants lined the entrance in silence. None of them dared speak. Their eyes lowered quickly whenever Jasmine glanced in their direction, not because they blamed her, but because they were ashamed to witness what they could not stop. Amara Bell stood near the side of the hall, with both hands pressed tightly together. Her eyes glistened, and every breath she took looked painful. She had dressed Jasmine on quiet mornings, brushed her hair through lonely evenings, and carried trays to her room when the Duchess had been too hurt to come downstairs. Now she watched her mistress be abandoned in front of the entire household. Alistar helped Eleanor into the carriage first. The gesture was proper, gentle, public, and that made it worse. He held her hand as she stepped inside. Eleanor lowered herself onto the velvet seat with the grace of a woman entering a future she had stolen. Only then did she glance back toward the doorway. Her eyes met Jasmine's. No words passed between them. But Eleanor's face said enough. She wanted Jasmine to feel it. The replacement, the insult, the message that the Duke had chosen who deserved to be seen. Alistar turned next. For one heartbeat, he looked back. The distance between him and Jasmine was not far, only a few steps. A short walk across stone, a moment of courage. A single word could have changed everything. He could have dismissed the carriage. He could have told Eleanor to return home. He could have looked at the servants and said, "Bring the Duchess her cloak." But he did none of those things. His eyes rested on Jasmine's face. And in that brief silence, guilt moved through him like a shadow. He saw her standing there with no jewels, no escort, no place in his evening. And for the first time that day, he looked like a man who understood the ugliness of his own choice. But understanding was not the same as courage. Alistar lowered his gaze. Then he stepped into the carriage. The footman closed the door. The sound was small, but to Jasmine it landed like a verdict, a crack of wood and iron, a final answer. The driver lifted the reins, and the wheels began to turn over the gravel. Slowly at first, then faster, as the carriage moved down the long path toward the iron gates. Eleanor's pale gown flashed once behind the window curtain before the carriage curved away. Alistar did not return, he did not call out. He did not stop the horses. He left his wife standing in the doorway of her own home, abandoned before the servants who were supposed to bow to her, pitied by the maids who were supposed to dress her, and replaced by a woman whose only claim was the approval of a cruel court. He had not struck her. He had not shouted at her. He had done something colder. He had made her invisible. For a long moment, Jasmine remained still. The sound of the carriage faded beyond the gates. The servants did not move. Even the wind seemed to wait for her to break. But Jasmine did not break the way they expected. She did not fall to her knees. She did not cover her face. She did not ask why he had done it, because the answer had already ridden away in a black carriage with another woman at his side. Instead, she turned slowly from the doorway. Her face was calm, but something in her eyes had changed. The quiet sadness that had lived there all morning began to harden into something sharper, older, and far more dangerous than grief. Amara stepped forward, her voice trembling as she whispered Jasmine's name. Jasmine looked at her maid. Then, with a steadiness that made every servant in the hall lift their eyes, she spoke. "Amara, bring me the key to my mother's cedar chest." The maid froze. Mrs. Agnes Rowe, still standing near the corridor, drew in a soft breath, because everyone who had served Jasmine closely knew that chest had not been opened in years. It sat in the private chamber at the end of the west wing, locked beneath a white cloth, untouched since the day Jasmine's mother was buried. No one knew everything inside it, but Agnes knew enough to be afraid. Amara wiped her tears quickly and hurried away. Jasmine stood alone in the hall a moment longer, listening to the fading echo of carriage wheels beyond the estate. Then she lifted her chin. The Duke had gone to the palace to hide her, but before the night was over, Jasmine Vance would remind him that a woman can only be hidden for as long as she allows the world to close its eyes. Amara returned with a key in both hands, as though she were carrying something far heavier than a small piece of iron. No one spoke as Jasmine led the way through the west wing. The corridors there were quieter than the rest of Ravenshade Manor. Fewer servants passed that side of the house. The carpets were older, the curtains darker, the air touched by the faint scent of lavender and cedar, as if memory itself had settled into the walls and refused to leave. At the end of the passage stood a small private chamber that Jasmine had not opened for many months. It had once belonged to her mother whenever she visited Ravenshade lands, long before Jasmine became a duchess. Long before marriage placed a noble title on her shoulders and loneliness inside her heart. A white cloth covered the cedar chest near the foot of the bed. Dust rested gently over it. Amara hesitated near the doorway, but Jasmine walked forward without fear. For years, that chest had remained locked, not because Jasmine had forgotten what was inside, but because opening it meant admitting that the woman her husband had hidden was never powerless. It meant touching a past she had tried to keep buried. It meant remembering that her mother had warned her, long ago, that a woman should never place her worth in the hands of people too blind to see it. Jasmine took the key from Amara. The lock resisted at first. Then it turned. The sound echoed softly through the chamber. When the lid opened, the scent of cedar rose into the air, warm and old, carrying with it the silence of years. Inside lay a gown of deep royal blue, folded with such care that it seemed untouched by time. Beneath it were sealed letters tied with faded silver ribbon, a royal invitation bearing the crown's mark, and a small velvet case resting at the center like a sleeping secret. Jasmine lifted the case. Mrs. Agnes Rowe, who had followed them in silence, stepped closer. The moment Jasmine opened it, the old housekeeper's face changed. Inside was a sapphire brooch shaped like a crown lily. It caught the fading afternoon light and answered with a glow so rich and deep that even Amara drew in a sharp breath. The petals had been carved from blue stones, each one edged with tiny diamonds. At the center was a small golden crown, so delicate that only someone close enough would notice it. But Agnes noticed, and fear moved across her face. She knew what that symbol meant. The crown lily was not decoration. It was not a pretty jewel chosen for vanity. It belonged to an older part of the kingdom's history, one most nobles pretended to respect while quietly hoping it would remain buried. It was tied to the women of a protected noble line, a line granted honor by the crown after a dangerous season of war, betrayal, and royal negotiation. Amara looked from the brooch to Jasmine, confused and frightened by the sudden silence. Agnes could barely keep her voice steady as she explained that no ordinary woman wore such a piece. The crown lily had been carried by women whose names were written into royal records, women who had served the kingdom when powerful men failed to keep peace. And then Jasmine touched the brooch gently, as though touching her mother's hand. Her mother had not been the nameless outsider the court whispered about. She had not been some poor woman who had climbed too high by marrying into the Vance family. She had been Lady Seraphina Vance, a woman of grace, intelligence, and courage, a woman who had once served the crown during a diplomatic crisis that nearly tore the kingdom apart. When noblemen shouted for war, Seraphina had carried messages between enemies. When court advisors fed the crown lies, Seraphina had uncovered the truth. When the kingdom needed someone who could speak without pride and listen without fear, it had been Seraphina who stepped forward, and for that service the crown had honored her bloodline. But after Seraphina's death, her name was pushed into corners. Her records disappeared from the conversations of nobles. Her daughter was treated as though she had inherited nothing but skin the court chose to judge, and silence it chose to mistake for weakness. Jasmine had known the truth. She had always known. The letters in the chest proved it. The invitation proved it. The brooch proved it. Her mother's seal, her mother's handwriting, and the crown's own mark rested before them like witnesses waiting for the right courtroom. But Jasmine had never used them, not when the old families whispered, not when Eleanor smiled at her across crowded rooms, not when Alistar grew colder each time noble gossip reached his ears. Because somewhere deep inside her, Jasmine had wanted one thing that no royal document could give. She wanted her husband to choose her without needing proof. She wanted him to stand beside her because she was his wife, not because her mother's name carried power. She wanted love that did not require a title to become brave. She wanted honor before evidence, and that was why the pain of this night cut so deeply. Alistar had not failed to recognize a noblewoman. He had failed to recognize his wife. Jasmine looked down at the blue gown waiting inside the chest, then at the sapphire-crowned lily resting in her palm. The woman who had stood abandoned in the doorway was gone. In her place stood the daughter of Jasmine Vance, and before the royal banquet ended, the court would remember the name it had tried so hard to forget. While Jasmine stood before her mother's open chest at Ravenshade Manor, the royal banquet at Alderwick Palace had already begun to bloom into a night of glitter, music, and careful deception. The palace was alive with candlelight. Tall windows reflected the glow of chandeliers. Gold-framed mirrors multiplied every jewel, every smile, every silk gown that swept across the marble floor. Servants moved like shadows between clusters of nobles, carrying crystal glasses and silver trays, while musicians played from the balcony above, filling the ballroom with a melody soft enough for secrets to travel beneath it. This was not merely a celebration, it was a stage, and every noble in the kingdom had arrived prepared to perform. Dukes greeted barons with smiles that hid old grudges. Ladies touched gloved hands to painted fans while studying every gown in the room. Young heirs bowed too deeply to powerful families, and older men watched from corners, measuring who had risen, who had fallen, and who could still be useful. Then the palace herald lifted his staff. The next arrival was announced. Duke Alistar Stirling of Ravenshade entered the ballroom with Lady Eleanor Vance on his arm. The effect was immediate. Heads turned. Whispers moved across the room like wind passing through dry leaves. Alistar looked every inch the nobleman the court expected him to be. His black coat was cut perfectly to his broad frame. Gold buttons caught the light with every step. His expression remained composed, unreadable, trained by years of court life to reveal nothing he did not wish others to see. Beside him, Eleanor glowed. Her ivory gown seemed made for that room. Pearls rested against her throat. Her hair was arranged with careful elegance. Her smile was soft, graceful, and full of victory. She did not need anyone to announce what she wanted the court to believe. She walked beside Alistar as if she belonged there, and the court accepted the image almost too easily. A few noblewomen leaned together behind their fans. Their eyes flicked from Eleanor's hand on Alistar's arm to the empty space where Jasmine should have stood. One of them smiled. Another gave a quiet nod, as if a mistake had finally been corrected. To them, Eleanor looked like the woman the Duke should have married. Old blood. Familiar manners. A face the court already knew how to welcome. No one asked loudly where Jasmine was. That would have been too direct. Cruelty in royal rooms preferred perfume, silk, and whispers. Eleanor felt every glance and fed on it. With each step, her back straightened a little more. Her fingers rested more confidently on Alistar's sleeve. She greeted the nobles with the controlled sweetness of a woman pretending humility while tasting triumph. For years, she had watched Jasmine carry a title Eleanor believed should have been hers. She had smiled through family visits, bowed through ceremonies, and waited for the court to do what it always did to women who did not fit its image, reject them. And now, standing beneath the chandeliers at Alistar's side, Eleanor believed the night had finally given her what she deserved. Alistar, however, did not enjoy the whispers the way she did. He heard them. He felt them. He saw the approval in the eyes of men who had once questioned his marriage. He saw ladies who had never warmed to Jasmine now smile at Eleanor, as if they had been waiting for this arrangement all along. And for one dangerous moment, the approval almost comforted him. It told him he had made the practical choice, the safe choice, the choice expected of a duke. But beneath that comfort was something colder, because the more the court accepted Eleanor, the more obvious Jasmine's absence became. Not to everyone, but to him, each bow Eleanor received seemed to press against his chest. Each approving smile reminded him of the woman he had left standing in the doorway of Ravenshade Manor, watching another woman ride away in her place. Then Cavendish Jasper appeared beside Eleanor with a glass of wine in his hand and satisfaction in his eyes. He praised the evening without saying too much. That was his way. He never placed the knife in full view until it had already entered the flesh. He told Eleanor quietly that the room had understood exactly what it needed to understand. By morning, the old families would speak of how naturally she stood beside the Duke. By the next council gathering, they would begin asking whether Ravenshade deserved a duchess who could appear publicly, gracefully, and without controversy. Eleanor's smile did not move, but her eyes brightened. Cavendish continued, lowering his voice even further. Before the night ended, Alistar would feel the weight of noble approval. And once a man like Alistar remembered how sweet public respect could taste, he would not be eager to return to the shame he had hidden at home. Eleanor lifted her glass and looked across the ballroom as though she were already mistress of Ravenshade. In a voice soft enough that only Cavendish could hear, she said Jasmine would soon become nothing more than a mistake from the Duke's past. A quiet error, a private embarrassment, a name removed from invitations and eventually from memory. Cavendish smiled, but across the room another man was watching. Chancellor Clement Willoughby stood near the royal table, his silver hair catching the candlelight. He was older than most of the men in that room, and far more dangerous than he appeared. He did not move quickly, he did not speak often, but he had served the crown long enough to know when a room was lying. And that night, the lie was standing on Duke Alistar's arm. Clement's eyes narrowed as he studied Eleanor. He knew the Vance family. He knew their branches, their marriages, their ambitions, and their old resentments. Eleanor was noble, yes, polished, certainly, but she was not the Duchess of Ravenshade. The Duchess of Ravenshade was Jasmine, and Jasmine was missing. That absence troubled him more than anyone else seemed to understand. Clement remembered another woman with the Vance name, a woman with a calm voice, dark eyes, and courage that had once steadied a frightened court, Lady Seraphina Vance. The memory was old but not forgotten, at least not by him, so when Alistar passed near the royal table, Clement stepped forward. The movement was small, but it carried authority. Alistar stopped at once. Eleanor's hand tightened slightly on his arm. Clement greeted the Duke with proper courtesy, then allowed his gaze to shift toward the empty space beside him. Not Eleanor, not the woman pretending, the absence. Then he asked why the Duchess of Ravenshade was not present. The question was calm, too calm. Several nearby nobles paused to listen. Alistar felt the room change around him. It was the first time that night anyone of true importance had spoken Jasmine's title aloud. For a brief second, he seemed unprepared. His eyes moved toward Eleanor, then Cavendish, then back to Clement. At last he said the Duchess was unwell. It was a simple answer, a respectable answer, a convenient answer. But Clement Willoughby had spent too many years hearing convenient answers from men with something to hide. He looked at Alistar for a long moment, and the silence between them became uncomfortable. Eleanor lowered her lashes and smiled as if concerned for Jasmine's health. But Clement did not look at her. Cavendish shifted his wineglass from one hand to the other. Alistar tried to hold his expression steady. Yet for the first time since arriving at the palace, he felt the lie begin to crack. Clement gave a slow nod, but there was no belief in it, only warning. Because he knew something the rest of the court had forgotten. Some women could be hidden from a ballroom, but not from history. Back at Ravenshade Manor, the West Wing had grown quiet, but it was no longer the silence of defeat. It was the silence before a woman changed the course of her own life. Jasmine stood before the open cedar chest, looking down at the deep blue gown her mother had left behind. For years it had waited in darkness, folded beneath letters, memories, and the kind of truth powerful people hoped would remain untouched. Now the silk seemed almost alive beneath the candlelight, rich and dark, like the sky just before night reveals its stars. Amara lifted the gown carefully, her hands trembling. She had seen fine dresses before. Ravenshade Manor held wardrobes filled with satin, lace, velvet, and imported thread. But this was different. This gown did not look made for decoration. It looked made for arrival, for recognition, for a woman who did not need the room to welcome her before she entered it. Jasmine said nothing as Amara helped her dress. Piece by piece, the hidden Duchess disappeared and something older rose in her place. The woman who had stood in the doorway abandoned by her husband was still there, but she was no longer alone. Her mother's courage seemed to move with the silk. Her mother's name seemed to breathe through the quiet chamber. Every ribbon pulled tight, every fold arranged, every pearl clasped into place became a reminder that Jasmine had never been the small woman court wanted her to be. Mrs. Agnes Rose stepped behind her and smoothed the gown at her shoulders. The old housekeeper's eyes were wet, but her hands were steady. She had served noble women all her life, dressed them for weddings, funerals, births, banquets, and scandals. But as she looked at Jasmine now, she understood that this was not a woman dressing to chase a husband. This was a woman dressing to face a kingdom. Amara opened the velvet case and lifted out the sapphire brooch. For a moment, no one moved. The crown lily caught the candlelight, blue and silver and gold, glowing with the quiet authority of something that had survived lies, dust, and time. Agnes took it carefully and pinned it near Jasmine's heart. The moment the brooch touched the gown, the room changed. Jasmine looked into the mirror. She did not look like Eleanor. She did not look like a woman trying to compete with Eleanor. That was the power of it. Eleanor had dressed to be chosen. Jasmine had dressed to be remembered. Her beauty was not loud. It did not beg for approval. It stood calmly in the room, carrying grief, grace, and a truth no insult could erase. Amara stepped back, covering her mouth as if she might cry again. But this time they were not tears of pity. They were tears of awe. Jasmine's eyes remained steady on her reflection. For the first time that day, she did not see the wife Alistar had left behind. She saw Seraphina's daughter. She saw the Duchess of Ravenshade. She saw a woman who had waited too long for others to give her permission to stand in her own name. Then hurried footsteps broke the stillness. The door opened suddenly, and Tobias Reed stumbled into the chamber, breathless from running. His face was pale, his hair disordered, and one of his gloves was missing. He looked first at Agnes, then Amara, then finally at Jasmine, as if the sight of her in that gown had stolen the words from his mouth. Agnes snapped at him to speak. Tobias swallowed hard. He had gone to the lower corridor after the Duke's carriage departed. He had not meant to listen, but near the servants' entrance he had heard voices from the side courtyard. Cavendish Jasper had spoken with one of Eleanor's men before leaving for the palace. They believed Jasmine would remain at Ravenshade, wounded and silent. They believed no one would challenge them. Then Tobias heard the truth. By the end of the banquet, Cavendish intended to suggest before the right nobles that Jasmine had refused her duties as Duchess. Eleanor would support the story with gentle concern, pretending Jasmine had become unstable, withdrawn, and unfit for public life. If the court believed it, Alistar could be pressured to remove her from all public responsibilities. Later, with enough noble support, they could push for separation, maybe even annulment. Amara gasped. Agnes whispered a prayer under her breath. But Jasmine did not look surprised. The cruelty of the plan was sharp, but not unfamiliar. Women like Eleanor did not only want a wound, they wanted the wound to leave no witness. Men like Cavendish did not only want power, they wanted power dressed as law. And now Jasmine understood the full shape of the night. This was not merely a husband's shame. This was not simply Eleanor enjoying borrowed attention. They were not trying to embarrass her. They were trying to erase her, to take her title, to bury her mother's name, to turn her silence into evidence against her, to make the court believe she had hidden herself because she was broken, instead of admitting that she had been pushed into the shadows by the very man sworn to protect her. For a long moment, Jasmine looked at Tobias. The young footman lowered his head, afraid he had brought terrible news too late. But Jasmine only reached for the sealed invitation inside the chest. The crown's mark was still unbroken. Then she gathered the letters tied with silver ribbon and placed them into Amara's hands. Agnes took the small velvet case. Tobias stood near the door, waiting for an order, his fear slowly turning into loyalty. Jasmine turned from the mirror. There was no trembling in her voice when she spoke. "Prepare the second carriage." Amara stared at her. Agnes lifted her chin. Tobias stepped aside at once, and as the servants rushed to obey, Jasmine walked out of her mother's chamber with the crown lily against her heart, and the truth following behind her like a storm. The Duke had gone to the palace to present another woman, but the Duchess was coming to present herself. At the far end of Alderwick Palace, beyond the glittering ballroom and the laughter of nobles who believed the night already belonged to them, the second carriage from Ravenshade Manor arrived at the palace steps. No crowd waited for it. No noble family turned with expectation. No one inside the ballroom knew that the woman they had dismissed, the woman they believed was still hidden behind the walls of her husband's estate, had crossed the city with her mother's truth pinned over her heart. The footman opened the carriage door. Jasmine stepped out. The night air moved softly around her blue gown. Candlelight from the palace windows touched the sapphire brooch at her chest, making the crown lily glow like a quiet flame. Amara stood behind her, holding the folded letters close. Tobias remained near the carriage, breathless and pale, but determined. For a moment Jasmine looked up at the palace. Alderwick had been built to intimidate. Its tall stone columns rose like judgment. Its wide steps seemed made for people who had been welcomed by birth, wealth, or fear. Through the windows, she could see movement, silk, gold, and shadows passing beneath chandeliers. Somewhere inside that palace, her husband stood with another woman. Somewhere inside, Eleanor was smiling in her place. And somewhere inside, men like Cavendish were already turning Jasmine's silence into a weapon against her. Jasmine climbed the steps. She did not hurry. A woman running could be called desperate. A woman trembling could be called unfit. A woman shouting could be dismissed as unstable. So Jasmine gave them none of those things. She walked calmly, carrying herself with the grace of someone who had been wounded deeply and still refused to bend beneath it. At the entrance, a palace attendant moved to stop her. The royal herald, Edmund Vale, stood near the guest register with his silver staff in hand. He was used to late arrivals, misplaced names, noble tempers, and families who believed their titles could erase every inconvenience. But when he looked down at the list before him, his brow tightened. Jasmine's name was not there. Not as Duchess of Ravenshade, not as Lady Jasmine, not anywhere. For a heartbeat, the lie had done its work. Edmund hesitated, glancing from the register to Jasmine's face. He told her carefully that her name did not appear among the invited guests. Behind him, a younger attendant shifted with discomfort, ready to summon someone who could quietly remove the problem before it reached the ballroom. Jasmine did not raise her voice. She reached into her glove and presented a sealed invitation. The crown's mark rested on it, untouched and undeniable. Edmund took it, and the moment his eyes fell upon the seal, his posture changed. He broke it carefully. Read the name written inside, and the color drained slightly from his face. Her Grace, Jasmine Stirling, Duchess of Ravenshade. The title had been there all along. Only someone had tried to keep it from the room. Edmund looked at Jasmine again, but now there was respect in his eyes, and something else too. Concern. Because palace servants knew better than anyone that when a true name disappeared from a royal list, it was rarely an accident. Jasmine gave him a small nod. That was all the permission he needed. Inside the ballroom, Eleanor was laughing beside a circle of noble women when the great doors began to open. The sound reached the room before the announcement did. Heavy doors, old hinges, a deep echoing movement that made several guests turn their heads. The music continued for 2 more notes, then faltered. Edmund Vale stepped forward, silver staff striking the marble floor. Once, his voice rang through the ballroom. Her Grace, Jasmine Stirling, Duchess of Ravenshade. The name moved through the room like lightning, not loud, not chaotic, but bright enough to expose every hidden face. Conversations died one by one. Fans lowered, glasses paused halfway to painted lips. Men who had been laughing turned slowly toward the entrance, their expressions shifting from amusement to confusion. Then Jasmine appeared in the doorway. Alone, no husband beside her. No nobleman guiding her arm. No escort shielding her from the weight of the room, only Jasmine. She stood beneath the arch of the palace doors in a gown of deep royal blue, the silk falling around her with quiet majesty. Her shoulders were straight, her chin lifted, her eyes steady. The sapphire crown lily rested near her heart, catching the chandelier light with every breath she took. For a moment, even the room seemed unsure what to do with her. The same nobles who had accepted Eleanor so easily now stared at the woman they had expected never to see. Some looked shocked, some looked amused. Some looked offended that she had dared to interrupt the comfortable lie they had already chosen to believe. A soft laugh escaped from somewhere near the side of the room, then another. A few ladies lifted their fans, hiding smiles that were not kind. They expected embarrassment. They expected Jasmine to tremble beneath the weight of their judgment. They expected a hidden wife who had wandered into a place too bright for her. But Jasmine did not give them that. She took one step forward, then another. Her gown moved softly against the marble. Every step carried her deeper into the room, and every whisper seemed to follow behind her like dust disturbed by a coming storm. Eleanor saw her first. The smile on her face vanished so suddenly that the lady beside her stopped speaking mid-sentence. For the first time that night, Eleanor looked not proud, not polished, not victorious. She looked afraid. Alistar turned next. The world seemed to slow around him. His hand tightened around the glass he held. His face went still, then pale. He looked at Jasmine as though his own guilt had taken human form and walked into the ballroom dressed in royal blue. He had left her at Ravenshade Manor. He had watched the carriage door close. He had told himself the choice was done. But here she was, not broken, not hidden, not invisible. Jasmine's eyes met his only briefly. That was all. She did not stop for him. She did not ask him to come to her. She did not search his face for regret. She passed the Duke of Ravenshade as if he were no longer the center of her world, and that wounded him more deeply than anger ever could. Cavendish Jasper stiffened near the wine table. His eyes shot toward Edmund Vale, then toward the guest register, then back to Jasmine. The calculation behind his face began to crack. This was not part of the evening he had arranged. Jasmine was supposed to be at home, silenced by humiliation and trapped by absence. But she had brought herself into the room, and worse, she had brought proof. Near the royal table, Chancellor Clement Willoughby had been seated with his hands folded over his cane. He had watched many scandals in his lifetime. He had seen nobles lie, betray, flatter, kneel, and rise again with cleaner gloves and dirtier hearts. But when Jasmine entered, Clement did not first look at her gown. He looked at the brooch, the sapphire crown lily. For one breath, the old chancellor did not move. Then his eyes widened. Recognition passed across his face like a door opening in a long-forgotten room. Slowly, with great care, Clement Willoughby rose from his chair. That single movement changed the entire ballroom. Because Clement did not stand for beauty. He did not stand for drama. He did not stand because a young woman wished to be noticed. Clement Willoughby was the keeper of royal records, the guardian of old decrees, a man whose respect had to be earned by history itself, and he was standing for Jasmine. The soft laughter died at once. A silence spread outward from the royal table, cold and sharp. Nobles who had smiled moments earlier began exchanging uneasy glances. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her fan until the delicate frame nearly bent. Alistar stared at Clement, then at the brooch, then back at Jasmine. For the first time that night, he began to understand that the woman he had left behind had not come to beg for a place. She had come to reveal one. Jasmine stopped beneath the chandeliers, calm as moonlight and twice as untouchable. The room waited, and in that waiting silence, every person inside Alderwick Palace felt the same question rise. What did the Chancellor know about the Duchess that her own husband did not? For several long seconds, no one in Alderwick Palace seemed to know what to do. Jasmine stood beneath the chandeliers with a sapphire-crowned lily glowing against her heart, and the entire ballroom held its breath around her. She had not entered with soldiers. She had not raised her voice. She had not demanded attention. Yet every eye had turned to her. That was what frightened Eleanor most. A woman like Eleanor understood noise. She understood gossip, charm, and public performance. She knew how to turn a whisper into a wound and a smile into a weapon. But Jasmine's calmness unsettled her, because calmness could not be easily mocked. So Eleanor did what desperate women in royal rooms often did. She covered cruelty with concern. Her face softened at once. Her lips parted as if she were troubled, not threatened. She stepped forward from her circle of noblewomen, ivory silk brushing against the marble floor, and looked at Jasmine with the kind of pity that begged the room to misunderstand. She spoke gently enough for the nearby nobles to hear. She asked why Jasmine had come alone. Not as a question of safety, not as a question of welcome, but as an accusation wrapped in manners. Her voice carried through the nearest circle, quiet but sharp, suggesting that perhaps the stress of the evening had confused the Duchess. Perhaps Jasmine had misunderstood the arrangements. Perhaps she had come to the palace in a moment of emotional weakness, not knowing how strange it looked to arrive without her husband, without an escort, and without the approval of the man whose name she carried. A few women behind Eleanor lowered their fans to hide their smiles. One elderly lord gave a soft cough that sounded too much like laughter. Another nobleman looked at Jasmine's gown, then leaned toward his companion and whispered something that made them both smirk. The court was beginning to recover from its shock. And once it recovered, it did what it had always done best. It tried to make the wounded person look unreasonable for bleeding. Alistar stood frozen near the center of the room, his face tight with humiliation, but still he said nothing. He looked from Eleanor to Jasmine, then to the royal table, as though searching for the safest place to rest his eyes. There was no safe place. Every corner of the ballroom now reflected his failure. Eleanor took another step forward, growing bolder when Alistar remained silent. She turned slightly, making sure the room could see her expression of false worry. She said it was understandable if Jasmine felt overwhelmed, especially after being unwell. After all, the Duke had already explained her absence to the Chancellor. No one would blame her if she wished to retire quietly before the evening became uncomfortable. It was clever. Too clever. With those words, Eleanor did not simply question Jasmine's presence. She tied Jasmine to Alistar's lie. She made it sound as though the Duchess had come despite illness, despite confusion, despite a husband's careful attempt to protect her from public strain. And the court, always hungry for a story that excused its cruelty, leaned toward that version. Then Cavendish Jasper moved in. He did not rush. He knew better than to appear alarmed. Instead, he stepped from beside the wine table with a calm expression and lowered voice, playing the role of a responsible royal advisor concerned only with order. But Gideon Montgomery saw him. The captain of the Royal Guard had been standing near one of the tall columns, watching the room with the stillness of a man trained to notice what others missed. He had seen Eleanor's smile vanish when Jasmine entered. He had seen Cavendish's hand tighten around his glass. He had seen the way Alistar looked at his wife, not with anger, but with guilt. And now he watched Cavendish step toward the nearest guard. Cavendish spoke smoothly, saying the Duchess seemed distressed, and that perhaps it would be kinder to escort her somewhere private. He made the suggestion sound merciful, but there was nothing kind in it. To remove Jasmine from the ballroom now would be to make her look unstable. It would turn her dignity into scandal. It would allow Eleanor to remain and let the court decide that the hidden Duchess had embarrassed herself. Several nobles nodded as if the idea made sense. Of course she should be removed. Of course the evening should continue. Of course the uncomfortable woman should disappear so everyone else could return to dancing. The old pattern was unfolding exactly as it had been designed. First, they denied Jasmine her place. Then they mocked her for arriving to claim it. Then they tried to call her presence a disturbance, but Jasmine did not move. Her eyes swept across the faces before her, not in fear, but in quiet recognition. She saw the women who had laughed behind fans. She saw the men who had judged her without speaking to her. She saw Eleanor standing in stolen confidence. She saw Cavendish arranging her humiliation as if it were palace business. And last, she looked at Alistar, only for a moment. That look said more than anger could have. It asked him whether he would stand there again and watch her be erased. Alistar's lips parted slightly, but no words came, so Jasmine turned away from him. The gesture was small, but it cut deeper than any insult. Then she looked back at Eleanor and spoke with a calm so steady that the laughter around the room began to weaken before she had even finished her sentence. She asked since when a lawful duchess needed permission to stand in a room where her own name had been invited. The words landed like a glass breaking on marble. No one laughed after that. The question was too simple to dismiss, too clean to twist, too public to bury, because everyone in the room understood what Jasmine had just done. She had not defended herself with emotion. She had not begged for sympathy. She had placed the truth in the center of the ballroom and left the court to step around it. If her name had been invited, then why had it vanished from the register? If she was unwell, why did she stand before them with more composure than those accusing her? If Eleanor was only a guest, why was she acting as though Jasmine needed permission from her? And if Alistar was truly the honorable duke the court believed him to be, why had his own wife been forced to arrive alone? The silence grew heavy. Eleanor's expression tightened, though she fought to keep her smile. Her eyes flicked toward Cavendish, searching for rescue. Cavendish's gaze hardened. He gave a small signal toward the guards near the side entrance. Most people missed it. Gideon Montgomery did not. His eyes followed the movement at once. Two guards shifted from their posts, uncertain but obedient, preparing to move toward Jasmine under the pretense of protecting palace order. Gideon stepped away from the column, slowly, deliberately. The kind of movement that did not announce danger, but warned it. He placed himself where he could see both Cavendish and the guards. Clement Willoughby remained standing near the royal table, his gaze fixed not on Eleanor, not on Alistar, but on the sapphire brooch pinned to Jasmine's gown. The old chancellor's face had changed. The recognition in his eyes had deepened into something close to disbelief, and that made the nobles even more uneasy. Because a room could laugh at a woman, it could question her manners, it could mock her arrival, but it could not easily ignore a chancellor who looked as though history itself had just walked through the palace doors. Alistar finally lowered his eyes. Shame moved across his face, plain enough now for Jasmine to see, and painful enough for the court to notice. He had expected the knight to protect his reputation. Instead, every word Jasmine spoke made that reputation look smaller. She had exposed him without shouting. She had revealed the insult without begging. She had taken the shame he placed on her and quietly returned it to its rightful owner. Eleanor saw it happening. The room was slipping from her control. Jasmine had not stolen the night with beauty alone. She had done something far more dangerous. She had made the nobles think, and in a court built on appearances, thought was the beginning of rebellion. The silence that followed Jasmine's question had not yet settled when Cavendish Jasper decided the room needed a distraction. A woman who could not be defeated by whispers had to be made ridiculous. A woman who refused to tremble had to be made to look stained. Near the edge of the ballroom, a young palace maid stood with a silver tray in her hands. Her name was Mabel Hart. And though most nobles would never remember the name of a servant who poured their wine, that night she carried more than crystal glasses and red velvet liquid. She carried someone else's cruelty. Her hands were not steady. Gideon Montgomery noticed that first. The maid was moving too slowly, too carefully, as if she had rehearsed every step and was terrified of forgetting the moment she was meant to fall. Her eyes kept flicking toward Eleanor, then toward Cavendish, then back to Jasmine's blue gown. No one else paid her much attention. That was how such things were done in palaces. The powerful gave the order, the weak carried it out, and afterward the blame landed neatly on the hands that had spilled the wine, never on the mouths that had commanded it. Mabel walked closer. The glasses trembled softly on the tray. Jasmine remained where she stood beneath the chandeliers, calm and watchful, unaware that another humiliation was approaching dressed in a servant's uniform. Eleanor saw Mabel coming. Her face did not change, but something small and satisfied moved behind her eyes. Cavendish turned slightly away, as if he had suddenly become interested in the musicians above the gallery. But his mouth held the faintest trace of expectation. Alistar, still caught between guilt and pride, did not notice until it was too late. Mabel reached Jasmine's side. For one breath, the room seemed to slow. Then the maid's foot twisted against the marble. Her body lurched forward. The silver tray tilted. Crystal glasses slid, struck one another, and shattered against the floor. Red wine flew through the air and splashed across Jasmine's deep blue gown, spreading like blood over silk. The ballroom gasped. It was a sharp, hungry sound, the kind of sound a crowd makes when it has been waiting for grace to fall and finally believes it has seen the first crack. Wine dripped from the folds of Jasmine's gown onto the polished marble. The rich stain spread across the fabric, dark and cruel beneath the chandelier light. A few ladies lifted their hands to their mouths. Others looked away with expressions that pretended sympathy but carried pleasure. Someone whispered that it was a terrible shame. Someone else murmured that perhaps the Duchess should have stayed home after all. Eleanor lowered her eyes, hiding the small smile she could not fully control. To the room she looked saddened. To Jasmine she looked exposed. Mabel dropped to her knees at once, stammering apologies so quickly the words tangled together. She called it an accident. She begged forgiveness. Her face had gone pale, and her hands shook violently as she reached for broken glass, cutting one finger without seeming to feel it. Cavendish stepped forward, his voice smooth and ready. He said the Duchess must be terribly distressed. He suggested again that she should be escorted from the ballroom to recover privately. He said no lady should be forced to remain in public after such an unfortunate embarrassment. Unfortunate. That was the word he chose. As if the room had not just watched a carefully placed insult unfold before them. The guards near the side entrance shifted again. Eleanor moved closer to Alistar, as though the sight of Jasmine stained and humiliated proved something she had always known. And Alistar finally looked fully at his wife. The wine marked her gown, broken glass glittered at her feet. The court stared at her with that cruel mixture of pity and judgment that could make even a strong woman feel naked beneath silk. For a moment, the old pattern waited for her. Cry, flee, break. Let them say she was overwhelmed. Let them say she was not made for royal rooms. Let them say Eleanor would have handled it better. But Jasmine did not cry. She did not cover the stain with frantic hands. She did not look to Alistar for rescue. She did not ask Eleanor why she was smiling. Instead, she accepted a clean white cloth from a nearby servant, pressed it gently against the wine on her gown, and lifted her eyes to the room. Her voice was quiet, clear, steady enough to make every whisper die. Wine can stain silk. It cannot stain truth. The words moved through the ballroom more powerfully than any shout. No one laughed. No one dared. Because Jasmine had done again what they could not understand. She had taken their insult and refused to carry it as shame. The stain remained on her gown, but somehow it no longer looked like disgrace. It looked like evidence. Eleanor's smile disappeared completely. Cavendish's eyes hardened. Mabel, still on the floor, looked as if she might faint. She began gathering the broken glass faster, desperate to leave, desperate to disappear back into the servant corridors before anyone asked the right question. But Gideon Montgomery had already moved. He crossed the marble floor with quiet authority and stopped beside her before she could rise. He did not grab her harshly. He did not frighten the room with violence. He simply placed one gloved hand on the edge of the silver tray and looked down at her with the calm of a man who had seen too much fear to mistake it for guiltless panic. Mabel froze. Gideon asked her to remain where she was. The maid's eyes filled with terror, not embarrassment, terror. And that single difference changed the feeling in the ballroom. Clement Willoughby's gaze shifted from Jasmine's stained gown to Mabel's trembling face, then to Eleanor, then to Cavendish. The old chancellor missed nothing. Alistar saw it too, though slower than he should have. He saw Mabel's fear. He saw Eleanor's stiffness. He saw Cavendish's careful stillness. Most of all, he saw Jasmine standing in the center of the room with wine on her gown and dignity still, untouched. Shame struck him harder than before, because any man could watch his wife insulted by strangers and call it court politics. But only a coward could recognize the cruelty and still remain silent. The room waited again. But this time, it did not wait for Jasmine to collapse. It waited to see who had ordered the wine to fall. The ballroom had changed. Only moments earlier, the nobles had looked at Jasmine as if she were an interruption to the evening. A stain on a perfect royal gathering, a hidden wife who had wandered into a place where she did not belong. But now, with red wine darkening her gown and a frightened maid held quietly beneath Gideon Montgomery's watch, no one seemed quite as certain as before. That uncertainty troubled the court more than the scandal itself, because noble society survived on easy judgments. It needed to know who deserved honor and who could be dismissed. It needed people placed neatly into boxes, titled and untitled, accepted and rejected, powerful and powerless. Jasmine was becoming difficult to place, and that made her dangerous. From the royal table, an older woman slowly lifted her chin. She was Lady Beatrice Ashcombe, the king's aunt, and one of the most feared women in Alderwick Palace. Age had softened nothing in her. Her silver hair was arranged beneath a black lace veil, her fingers glittered with rings, and her eyes had the cold patience of someone who had watched generations of nobles ruin themselves with careless words. When Lady Beatrice spoke, even the musicians seemed to lower their bows. She addressed Jasmine not with kindness, but with examination. If the Duchess of Ravenshade had chosen to enter the royal banquet under such unusual circumstances, Lady Beatrice said, then surely she understood the weight of royal protocol. Surely she understood that a banquet held under the crown's roof was more than decoration and dancing. It was a place of rank, memory, and order. Eleanor's eyes brightened. This was exactly what she had been waiting for. It was one thing for Jasmine to speak one brave sentence. It was another thing entirely to survive the questions of Lady Beatrice Ashcombe. Many younger nobles had left court dinners in tears after failing to answer her correctly. She could make ignorance look like treason and nervousness look like guilt. Eleanor took a small step back, allowing the moment to unfold. Cavendish folded his hands. Alistar looked toward Jasmine with quiet dread, because for the first time that night, he realized he did not know whether his wife could answer. He had never asked. Lady Beatrice began with court order. She asked where a duchess of a border house should stand when entering after the royal family but before foreign envoys. She asked how a noblewoman should greet a widowed queen mother when her own husband was present but had not escorted her. She asked what gift was proper when a house carried old debts to the crown. She asked which language should be used when greeting ambassadors from the southern coast and whether a duchess should speak first or wait to be addressed. Each question was elegant. Each question was a trap. The nobles leaned closer. Eleanor waited for hesitation, but Jasmine did not hesitate. She answered the first question with calm precision. A duchess of a border house, she said, honored the crown first, acknowledged the host second, and did not surrender her rank because others found her arrival inconvenient. A low murmur moved through the room. Lady Beatrice's eyes narrowed slightly. Jasmine answered the next question with the same steady grace. A widowed queen mother was to be greeted with lowered eyes and an open hand, not because age made her fragile, but because memory made her powerful. A husband's failure to escort his wife did not erase the wife's duty to show respect. That answer struck Alistar like a quiet blade. Still, Jasmine continued, she named the proper gift for a royal debt. She explained the meaning of black ribbon on a court invitation. She corrected, gently but firmly, a custom many younger nobles had mistaken for tradition. Then, when Lady Beatrice asked about the southern coast, Jasmine replied in the old diplomatic tongue, her pronunciation clean, graceful, and so unexpected that one of the foreign ministers near the royal table sat forward in surprise. The room went still. Eleanor's face lost color. Cavendish's expression tightened. The laughter that had followed Jasmine earlier now seemed foolish in the mouths that had carried it. Jasmine was not simply surviving the questions. She was mastering them, and she did it without arrogance. There was no sharpness in her voice, no need to punish the room with what she knew. She spoke the way her mother must have spoken once, with patience, discipline, and the quiet confidence of a woman who understood that true nobility was not noise. Lady Beatrice studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, she gave the smallest nod. It was not warmth, it was not affection. But in that court, from that woman, it was almost a crown. Across the room, Clement Willoughby finally spoke. His voice was soft, but everyone heard it. He said Lady Seraphina Vance had once served the crown as a diplomatic interpreter during one of the most delicate crises the kingdom had ever survived. He remembered her voice in the council chamber. He remembered how men twice her age had fallen silent when she corrected the terms of a treaty that could have sent thousands to war. Then his eyes moved to Jasmine. He said the daughter had inherited more than her mother's face. A ripple passed through the ballroom. Lady Seraphina Vance. The name had not been spoken openly in court for years. Some nobles looked confused. Others looked startled. A few older faces turned pale with recognition, as if a door they had sealed long ago had just opened by itself. Alistar stood without moving, but inside him, something collapsed. He looked at Jasmine as though seeing her for the first time, not as the wife he had hidden, not as the woman whose silence he mistook for simplicity, not as the duchess he thought would embarrass him beneath royal lights, but as someone shaped by history, trained by grief, taught by a mother whose name still had the power to change the air in a palace, and the shame of it nearly stole his breath. He had been ashamed of a woman he had never even tried to know. He had feared the court would discover she was unworthy. Instead, the court was discovering that he was. Jasmine stood in her stained gown, the sapphire crown lily shining over her heart, and for the first time that night, the nobles did not look at her with pity. They looked at her with caution, because intelligence had entered the room. Grace had entered the room. Bloodline had entered the room. And the woman they had tried to humiliate was beginning to look like the only person in the palace who truly belonged there. For one brief moment, it seemed as though the truth had begun to win. Jasmine stood beneath the chandeliers with wine staining her gown and the crown lily shining above her heart. Yet the shame no longer belonged to her. The court that had laughed was now uncertain. The nobles who had whispered were now careful. Lady Beatrice had tested her and found no weakness. Clement Willoughby had spoken her mother's name, and with that name, a forgotten part of the kingdom's history had stepped back into the room. Eleanor felt the ground slipping beneath her. She had imagined many versions of that night. She had imagined Jasmine hidden at Ravenshade, weeping in a dark room while the palace admired another woman on Alistar's arm. She had imagined herself praised, accepted, and quietly positioned as the better choice. She had imagined whispers turning into pressure, pressure turning into separation, and separation turning into victory. But she had not imagined this. She had not imagined Jasmine arriving alone. She had not imagined the brooch. She had not imagined the old chancellor rising from his chair like a man seeing history return from the grave. And she had certainly not imagined the court beginning to admire the woman it was supposed to reject. Desperation entered Eleanor's eyes, but only for a moment. Then her expression changed. The sweetness returned, the softness returned. And that was how Jasmine knew the next wound would come dressed as concern. Eleanor stepped forward slowly, one hand resting against her chest as if the evening had become too painful for her gentle heart to bear. Her ivory gown caught the light as she moved, untouched by wine, untouched by shame, untouched by the ugliness she had helped create. She looked first at Alistar, then at the royal table, then at the nobles gathered around them. Her voice trembled carefully when she spoke. Not too much, just enough to sound wounded, just enough to make the room lean in. She said she had hoped it would not come to this. She said she had wanted to protect the Duke from embarrassment. She said she had remained silent out of respect for the family, but Jasmine's behavior had left her with no choice. Alistar's face tightened. Clement's eyes narrowed. Jasmine remained still. Eleanor reached into the small beaded purse at her side and removed a folded letter. The paper was cream-colored, sealed with dark wax that looked official enough to fool those who wanted to be fooled. She held it like evidence, but her fingers trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from the effort of pretending innocence. She claimed the letter had been sent by a concerned servant from Ravenshade Manor. According to Eleanor, Jasmine had planned the evening for weeks. She had intended to arrive late, create a scene, accuse the Duke of mistreatment, and disgrace the house of Ravenshade before the crown. Eleanor said Jasmine had always resented the expectations of her title and had grown bitter because the court did not immediately accept her. A murmur moved through the room. It was soft at first, then it spread. Some nobles looked at Jasmine again, but this time with renewed suspicion. They had almost begun to respect her, but suspicion was easier for them. It allowed them to return to the story they preferred. A woman too proud, a wife too difficult, a duchess using emotion as a weapon. Cavendish Jasper stepped forward at once, as if he had been waiting for his place in the performance. He sighed deeply, the sigh of a man pretending regret while enjoying every word. He said that those closest to the Duke had long been concerned about Jasmine's temperament. He said she had isolated herself from household duties. He said she refused guidance, avoided public responsibilities, and carried resentment toward families who only wished to help her adjust to court life. Every sentence was poison, and every sentence was shaped carefully enough to sound reasonable. He did not call Jasmine mad. That would have been too crude. He called her troubled. He called her overwhelmed. He called her sensitive to imagined slights. He spoke the language of men who knew how to destroy a woman without appearing cruel. Turn her pain into instability. Turn her silence into guilt. Turn her dignity into pride. Turn her refusal to collapse into proof that she must be dangerous. The nobles began whispering again. A few who had admired Jasmine moments earlier now looked uncertain. Others seemed almost relieved, as though Eleanor's letter had returned the world to a shape they understood. Jasmine had expected cruelty, but she had not expected how quickly the room would be willing to doubt what it had just seen with its own eyes. Mabel still knelt under guard, trembling. The wine still stained Jasmine's gown. Clement still stood because of the crown lily. Lady Beatrice had just heard Jasmine answer every question with perfect grace. And still, a single letter was enough to make the court wonder if perhaps the humiliated woman was the guilty one. That was the danger of lies spoken in royal rooms. They did not need to be true. They only needed to be useful. Eleanor unfolded the letter and began reading selected lines aloud. Her voice shook beautifully in all the right places. She read words that painted Jasmine as jealous, resentful, and determined to ruin the Duke for choosing duty over personal comfort. Alistar listened, and the muscles in his jaw tightened. He knew something was wrong. He knew Jasmine did not write like that. He had seen her handwriting on household notes, quiet letters, and small instructions left for servants. The words Eleanor read had no trace of Jasmine's restraint, no sign of her careful mind. But doubt did not need to defeat him. Cowardice did. Eleanor finished reading and looked at Alistar as if she were begging him to confirm the truth. Cavendish turned to him as well. The nobles followed. And suddenly the entire weight of the ballroom rested on the Duke of Ravenshade. This was the moment, not when he left the manor, not when Jasmine entered alone, not when wine stained her gown. This was the moment that would reveal what kind of man he truly was. Jasmine turned toward him. She did not plead, she did not defend herself. She simply looked at her husband and waited. There were so many things he could have said. He could have said the letter was false. He could have said his wife was not unstable. He could have admitted that he had left her behind because he was ashamed, not because she was unwell. He could have told the entire court that Jasmine had never once disgraced his house, even when his house had disgraced her. He could have chosen her. At last, Alistar opened his mouth. The room waited. Jasmine waited too, and for one dangerous heartbeat something inside her still hoped. Not for romance, not for tenderness, only for fairness, only for the smallest act of courage from the man who had taken vows before her and then hidden behind silence when those vows became inconvenient. But Alistar looked at the letter, then at Eleanor, then at Cavendish, then at the nobles watching him with hungry eyes, and he hesitated. It was not long, perhaps only a breath. But a breath can be enough time for a heart to break. Jasmine saw the hesitation before anyone else understood it. She saw the fear cross his face. She saw the calculation. She saw the old weakness rise again, the same weakness that had offered Eleanor his arm, the same weakness that had left Jasmine in the doorway, the same weakness that had mistaken public approval for honor. And in that moment, the fake letter became less painful than the truth standing behind it. Eleanor could lie, Cavendish could scheme. The nobles could whisper until the chandeliers went dark. But Alistar's silence belonged to him alone. Jasmine's eyes softened, not with forgiveness, but with something far sadder, understanding. She had come to the banquet ready to face her enemies. She had not known she would have to face the emptiness where her husband's courage should have been. Alistar finally moved as if to speak, but the moment had already passed. Some wounds are not made by words, some are made by the absence of them. Clement watched Jasmine's closely, and perhaps he understood what had just happened inside her. Gideon's hand tightened at his side. Lady Beatrice leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable but sharp. Eleanor, seeing Alistar's hesitation, smiled faintly again. She believed she had won back the room. But she did not understand what she had awakened. Jasmine looked away from Alistar, slowly, completely, and when she did, something changed in the air around her. The wife who had waited for her husband to defend her was gone. In her place stood a woman who would defend herself. In that moment, Jasmine learned the most painful truth of the night. Her enemies could insult her. They could stain her gown. They could forge her name. They could turn a room full of nobles against her. But only her husband had the power to truly break her heart. The fake letter still rested in Eleanor's hand, but the damage had already begun to spread. It moved through the ballroom in whispers, in narrowed eyes, in the sudden distance that opened between Jasmine and the nobles who had almost begun to respect her. One moment, she had stood before them as the woman who answered Lady Beatrice with grace. The next, she was once again being measured by suspicion, not because the lie was strong, but because the room was willing to believe it. That was the cruelest part. Truth had to prove itself. Lies only needed permission. Cavendish Jasper saw his chance and stepped forward with the confidence of a man who believed he had bent the room back into his hands. His expression was solemn, almost regretful, but there was triumph beneath it. He looked toward Gideon Montgomery and gave the order clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear. The Duchess was to be escorted from the ballroom. For her own good, he said, for the dignity of the Duke's house, for the peace of the royal banquet. The words were dressed in concern, but no one missed the command beneath them. 2 guards shifted near the side entrance. Mabel Hart remained trembling on the floor. Eleanor lowered the letter with a satisfied softness in her eyes. Several nobles looked away, ready to let the matter end as long as the discomfort disappeared with Jasmine. But Gideon did not move. He stood between Cavendish and the guards, his face calm, his shoulders squared, his loyalty not to convenience but to justice. Cavendish's smile thinned. He repeated the order. Gideon answered in a voice low enough to be respectful but firm enough to be heard. There was no proof against the Duchess. The room changed again. Cavendish turned slowly toward him, and for the first time that evening, the polish in his face cracked. His eyes grew cold. He reminded Gideon that he was captain of the royal guard, not a judge. His duty was to preserve order, not question those who advised the crown. Gideon did not lower his gaze. He said order without truth was only fear wearing a uniform. A few nobles drew in sharp breaths. Cavendish stepped closer, lowering his voice but not his threat. He told Gideon that titles could be removed, ranks could be stripped. A captain who forgot his place could find himself guarding prison gates instead of palace doors. Still, Gideon did not step aside. For a moment, it seemed as if the royal banquet might turn into open conflict. Then Alistar finally moved. Jasmine heard his footsteps before she looked at him. He stepped from the watching crowd, his face pale with shame, his mouth set as though he had made a decision. For half a second, something in Jasmine's heart almost rose again. Perhaps this was it. Perhaps he had found the courage too late, but not too late to matter. Perhaps the man who had failed her twice in one night would now stand where he should have stood from the beginning. Alistar looked at Cavendish, then at Eleanor, then at Jasmine, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet. He said the matter should be handled privately. The word passed through Jasmine like cold rain. After everything, that was what he offered her. Not defense, not truth, not the public correction of a public wound. Only privacy. A place where powerful people could soften the story, hide the ugliness, and ask the wounded woman to be reasonable for the sake of everyone who had wounded her. Jasmine lifted one hand. Alistar stopped speaking. She turned fully toward him, and every person in the ballroom seemed to feel the force of that movement. Not because she moved angrily, not because she shouted, but because there was something final in the way she looked at him now. She said there was nothing private about her shame when he brought another woman there in her place. The words struck the ballroom harder than any accusation. Even Eleanor stopped breathing for a moment. Cavendish went still. Alistar's face changed as if Jasmine had taken every excuse he had built for himself and laid it bare beneath the chandeliers. Because she was right. There had been nothing private about the insult. The carriage had been public. The banquet entrance had been public. The whispers had been public. Eleanor's hand on his arm had been public. The wine on Jasmine's gown had been public. The forged letter had been public. And now that Jasmine had chosen to answer publicly, Alistar wanted privacy only because truth had finally turned its face toward him. The court fell silent. It was no longer the silence of curiosity. It was the silence of people who had watched a woman be pushed too far and suddenly understood that she had not come to plead for kindness. She had come to end the lie. Jasmine turned away from Alistar and reached for the sapphire brooch pinned near her heart. For the first time that night, her fingers trembled, only slightly. Not from fear, but from the weight of what the brooch meant. It had belonged to her mother. It had rested in darkness for years. It had carried a name the court had tried to forget, a history hidden under dust and polite denial. To remove it now was not a simple gesture. It was an offering, a challenge, a key placed into the hands of the only man in the room who might still know how to open the truth. Slowly, Jasmine unpinned the crown lily. The deep blue stones caught the chandelier light as she held it in her palm. The room watched, confused at first, then uneasy, as she crossed the small space between herself and Chancellor Clement Willoughby. Clement had not sat down since she entered. He remained near the royal table, older than nearly everyone in the room, yet suddenly more alert than any of them. His eyes followed the brooch with the expression of a man watching a memory return in physical form. Jasmine stopped before him. Without lowering her head in defeat, she placed the sapphire crown lily into his hands. The old chancellor accepted it carefully. The moment his fingers touched the metal, something changed in his face. He did not look surprised in the ordinary way. He looked shaken, as if the years had pulled back and shown him a room from long ago, a council chamber lit by stormlight, a woman speaking before frightened men, a seal pressed into wax, a promise made by the crown and then buried by those who feared what it protected. Clement turned the brooch slowly. His thumb brushed the tiny golden crown at the center of the lily. Then he saw the inscription along the back. The room waited. Even Lady Beatrice leaned forward. Cavendish's eyes sharpened. Eleanor's face went pale. Alistar stared at the brooch as though he were beginning to understand that he had not merely failed his wife. He had failed to ask who she truly was. Clement lifted his gaze to Jasmine. His voice was different when he spoke. Lower, careful, almost reverent. He asked where she got it. Jasmine's answer came without hesitation. It belonged to her mother. Lady Seraphina Vance of the Crown Lily line. The royal table reacted at once. Not loudly, not with chaos, but with the kind of shock that moves through powerful people when a forbidden name is spoken in the one place everyone hoped it would never return. Lady Beatrice's hand tightened around the arm of her chair. One of the foreign ministers exchanged a startled look with his aide. An older duke near the table went pale and quickly looked away. Clement stared at Jasmine, as though Seraphina herself had stepped into the ballroom through her daughter's eyes. The names spread through the room in fragments. Seraphina Vance, Crown Lily Line, Royal Protectorate, Old Decree, Forgotten Honor. Eleanor took one slow step backward. Cavendish's face hardened, but beneath the hardness was fear, because names had power in royal courts, and this name had been buried for a reason. Jasmine stood before them with wine on her gown, betrayal behind her, and her mother's legacy now resting in the Chancellor's hands. This was her darkest moment, but it was also the moment the darkness began to turn. The name of Lady Seraphina Vance did not simply pass through the ballroom, it unsettled it. For years, that name had been treated like an old portrait turned toward the wall. Still present, still belonging to the House of History, but hidden because too many powerful people preferred not to look at it. Some of the younger nobles had never heard it before. Others had heard it only in fragments spoken by older relatives in low voices after the doors were closed and the servants had gone. But Clement Willoughby remembered. He stood beneath the golden light of the royal table, holding the sapphire-crowned lily in both hands, and the calm authority that usually shaped his face had given way to something deeper. Grief, perhaps, regret, or the weight of a promise the kingdom had failed to keep. His voice was quiet when he spoke, but the room listened as though he had shouted. Lady Seraphina Vance, he said, was not a forgotten woman. She was a woman the court had chosen to forget. A silence moved through the nobles. Clement turned the brooch in his palm, letting the light catch the small golden crown at its center. Then he spoke of a time many in the room had been too young to remember, when the kingdom had stood dangerously close to war. Border houses had prepared soldiers. Foreign envoys had withdrawn from talks. Pride had filled the council chamber until peace seemed like weakness and bloodshed seemed inevitable. And in that hour, when titled men argued themselves into danger, Seraphina Vance had done what they could not. She listened, she translated. She carried messages between leaders who no longer trusted one another. She corrected false terms in a treaty before they could become a declaration of war. She exposed a forged report that would have sent the kingdom into battle for the benefit of men who stood to profit from chaos. Clement's eyes lifted toward the room. For her service, the crown granted Seraphina's line hereditary honor under the crown lily protection. That honor did not vanish with her death. It passed by blood. A wave of whispers broke out, then died almost immediately as Lady Beatrice Ashcombe raised one thin hand for silence. Alistar stared at Jasmine, not as a husband seeing his wife, as a man realizing he had been standing beside a locked door for years and had never asked what was behind it. Clement continued, but now his voice carried a sharper edge. After Lady Seraphina died, the records of that royal grant disappeared from the archive. The decree could not be found. The witness lists were missing. Her daughter's claim was never properly acknowledged, and over time, the court allowed absence to become denial. Cavendish Jasper's face had gone still, too still. Jasmine noticed, so did Clement, so did Gideon. Then Jasmine lifted her chin and spoke. The records had not disappeared, they were stolen. The words cut through the ballroom like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. No one moved. Jasmine turned her eyes toward Cavendish. For the first time that night, the royal advisor looked less like a man in control and more like a man counting how many exits stood between him and ruin. He gave a cold little laugh and called the accusation reckless. He said grief and humiliation had made the Duchess dramatic. He said old records were often misplaced, and no reasonable court should treat a woman's pain as evidence. But his voice did not sound as smooth as before. It had begun to crack at the edges. Then, from the side entrance of the ballroom, a firm voice broke through the tension. Captain Gideon Montgomery entered with Tobias Reed beside him. The young footman looked terrified to be standing before so many nobles, but he did not turn back. In his hands, he carried a sealed leather packet marked with travel dust and the faint imprint of a carriage compartment. Cavendish went pale. Eleanor's fan slipped slightly in her hand. Gideon stopped at the center of the room and bowed toward the royal table. He stated that Tobias Reed, servant of Ravenshade Manor, had reported suspicious instructions connected to the Duchess's exclusion from the banquet. Acting under palace authority to preserve order, Gideon had searched the advisor's carriage after witnessing attempts to remove the Duchess without proof. Cavendish stepped forward sharply, protesting that a captain had no right to touch his private property. But Lady Beatrice's voice stopped him cold. She said any man who sought to remove a Duchess before the crown had better welcome the truth that followed. Gideon handed the packet to Clement. The entire ballroom watched as the Chancellor broke the seal. Inside were papers, old papers, new papers, and enough evidence to make the air feel suddenly thin. Clement unfolded the first document. His face hardened. It was the missing royal decree bearing the crown's mark. the grant that confirmed Serafina Vance's hereditary honor and named her lawful descendants under Crown Lily protection. A murmur shook the room. Then Clement lifted the second paper, Jasmine's true invitation, not a copy, not a mistake. The original royal invitation addressed to Her Grace Jasmine Stirling, Duchess of Ravenshade. The invitation that had somehow been removed from the palace register. The invitation that proved she had not come uninvited, confused, or unstable. She had come because the crown itself had called her. Alistar lowered his gaze as though the words had struck him across the face. But Clement was not finished. From the packet came a smaller folded note, marked with hurried writing and a payment seal. Gideon looked toward Mabel Hart. The maid began to cry before anyone even accused her. The note recorded payment for a palace service, a spill at the proper moment, and a promise of additional coin once the Duchess had been escorted out in disgrace. The room turned toward Mabel, then toward Eleanor, then toward Cavendish. Eleanor took one careful step backward, but there was nowhere for her to go. The nobles who had surrounded her earlier now shifted away as if scandal were a sickness they feared catching from her sleeve. Cavendish opened his mouth, but no polished explanation came. For the first time all evening, he had no sentence ready, no gentle poison, no respectable lie, only fear. Jasmine watched him in silence. She did not smile, she did not look triumphant. Because this was not only about winning. It was about understanding the full cruelty of what had been done to her. They had not only planned to shame her for one night, they had hidden her invitation, stolen her mother's records, bribed a maid to ruin her gown, forged a letter to question her mind, and prepared to remove her from the ballroom before she could defend herself. All of it had been arranged before she ever stepped through the palace doors. The question hanging over the room was no longer whether Jasmine belonged there. The question was far more terrible. How long had they been planning to erase her? Clement Willoughby stood at the center of the ballroom with the royal decree open in his hands. For a moment, even he seemed to feel the weight of the words before he spoke them. The old parchment trembled slightly beneath his fingers, not because he was afraid, but because the truth had waited too many years to be read aloud. Around him, the nobles held their breath. The musicians had stopped playing entirely. The servants stood frozen near the walls. Even the candles seemed to burn more quietly, as if the palace itself understood that history was about to correct a lie. Jasmine stood before them in her stained blue gown. The wine had dried into the silk, dark and visible beneath the chandelier light. Her hands were empty now that the brooch rested with Clement, but she had never looked more complete. She did not stand behind Alistar. She did not stand beside Eleanor. She did not look toward Cavendish for permission or toward the court for mercy. She stood alone, and somehow that made her look stronger than everyone else in the room. Clement lifted the decree and began to read. His voice carried clearly through the ballroom, old but powerful, each word striking the marble floor like a bell. The document confirmed that Lady Serafina Vance had served the crown during a season of grave diplomatic danger. It named her as a woman whose courage, intelligence, and loyalty had protected the kingdom from war. It stated that, by royal authority, her family line had been granted hereditary honor under the protection of the Crown Lily seal. Then Clement paused, his eyes moved to Jasmine. The silence became almost unbearable, and then he read the final part. The honor passed by blood to Serafina's lawful descendants, to Jasmine Vance. Now Jasmine Stirling, lawful Duchess of Ravenshade, recognized daughter of the Crown Lily line. A sound moved through the ballroom, not quite a gasp, not quite a whisper. It was the sound of a room discovering that it had mocked the wrong woman. The noble ladies who had hidden their laughter behind fans slowly lowered them. Men who had smirked at Jasmine's stained gown now looked away. Those who had accepted Eleanor without question suddenly seemed very interested in the floor beneath their polished shoes. The truth had changed the shape of the room. Jasmine was not an unwanted wife begging to be accepted. She was not an embarrassment Alistar could hide in the West Wing. She was not a woman who had wandered into a palace where she did not belong. She belonged by marriage, she belonged by invitation. And now, before every noble who had tried to deny her, she belonged by royal honor. Lady Beatrice Ashcombe rose next. The movement was slow, but it carried the force of a command. The king's aunt looked across the ballroom, her sharp eyes resting first on Clement, then on Jasmine, then on every noble who had laughed too freely before understanding the cost. Her voice was cold, clear, and impossible to ignore. She ordered the court to acknowledge the Duchess of Ravenshade properly. No one moved at first, not because they refused, because shame had made them slow. Then Edmund Vale, the royal herald, stepped forward with his silver staff. His face was solemn now. Gone was the confusion from the doorway. Gone was the hesitation caused by a stolen guest list. He struck the staff against the marble floor once, and the sound rang through the hall like judgment. In a loud voice, he announced her name. Her Grace, Jasmine Stirling, Duchess of Ravenshade, daughter of the Crown Lily Line. The words filled the ballroom. They climbed the walls. They reached the chandeliers. They settled over every bowed head that had once risen above her in pride. For one heartbeat, Jasmine did not move. Then the first noble bowed. It was an older duke near the royal table, a man who had whispered against her earlier and now could not meet her eyes. After him, another lowered his head. Then a lady curtsied with trembling fingers. Then another, then another. One by one, the court bent before the woman it had tried to shame. The sight was so powerful that even the servants forgot to hide their faces. Amara, standing near the far entrance with tears in her eyes, pressed one hand to her mouth. Tobias Reed stared as though he could hardly believe the same room that had mocked Jasmine was now forced to honor her. Eleanor remained standing. For the first time that night, she looked small. Her ivory gown, once so perfect beneath the chandeliers, now seemed pale and empty. The pearls at her throat no longer looked elegant. They looked like decorations on a lie. She looked around for support, but the women who had praised her earlier had already stepped away. No one wanted to stand too close to disgrace when the crown was watching. Her hand tightened around the fake letter until the paper bent. But there was nothing left for her to say. The room no longer belonged to her. Cavendish Jasper looked even worse. All evening he had moved through the palace like a man controlling invisible strings. He had arranged the missing invitation. He had guided Eleanor's pride. He had tried to turn Alistar's weakness into political power. He had ordered Jasmine's removal, confident that her silence would protect him. But now the documents lay open. The payment note had been seen. The stolen record had been read. The royal decree had spoken louder than any lie he could invent. His face had lost its color. His eyes darted from Gideon to Clement, from Clement to Lady Beatrice, searching for a path of escape inside a room that had become a cage. And then there was Alistar. The Duke of Ravenshade stood beneath the same chandeliers that had once made him look powerful. But now, surrounded by bowing nobles and exposed truth, he looked like a man stripped of every excuse. He watched his wife receive the honor he had denied her. He watched strangers bow to the woman he had abandoned in his own doorway. He watched the court recognize what he had failed to protect, and the shame of it settled over him heavier than any crown. Jasmine turned slowly. For the first time since Clement began reading, her eyes met Alistar's. There was no triumph in her gaze. That made it worse. If she had smiled cruelly, he might have endured it. If she had humiliated him with anger, he might have hidden behind pride. But Jasmine looked at him with quiet sorrow, and that sorrow told him he had not merely been wrong. He had been unworthy of the dignity she had shown him. The court remained bowed around her. The woman he had tried to hide had become the center of the royal banquet. The woman he had replaced had become the only one everyone now honored. And as the last noble lowered their head, the truth of the night became impossible to deny. Duke Alistar Stirling had brought Lady Alistar Vance to the palace because he was ashamed of his Black Duchess. But before the final dance, Jasmine had stolen the night without begging for it, without fighting for attention, and without lowering herself to the cruelty that tried to destroy her. She had walked in alone and made the entire kingdom see her. The ballroom remained bowed for one final breath before Lady Beatrice Ashcombe lifted her hand. Only then did the nobles rise. But they did not rise as they had stood before. Something had changed in the room. The laughter was gone. The easy cruelty had disappeared from their faces. Even the proudest families now seemed careful with their eyes, careful with their hands, careful with the space they allowed between themselves and the people who had tried to destroy Jasmine. The royal banquet had become a court of judgment. And there, beneath the chandeliers, Mabel's heart finally broke. The young maid was still trembling beside Gideon Montgomery, her face streaked with tears, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned pale. She had watched the decree read aloud. She had seen the nobles bow. She had seen Eleanor's protection vanish like smoke in the wind, and now there was nothing left for her to hide behind. When Clement Willoughby turned toward her with the payment note in his hand, Mabel sank lower, almost collapsing against the marble floor. Her confession came out in broken pieces. She said Lady Eleanor had sent for her 2 days before the banquet. Not directly at first. Never directly. A message had come through a servant from the Vance household. Then there had been a meeting near the old garden passage, where Eleanor had promised coin if Mabel would create a moment of embarrassment during the royal banquet. A spill, a stumble, nothing too dangerous. Just enough to make the Duchess look foolish. Just enough to give Cavendish a reason to have her escorted away. The room turned toward Eleanor. Eleanor's face hardened at once. She denied it quickly, too quickly, her voice sharp beneath the silk of her manners. She called Mabel frightened. She called her confused. She said no noblewoman would lower herself to bargain with a palace maid over something so childish. But Mabel, now crying openly, lifted her head. She said Eleanor had told her exactly where to stand, exactly when to move, exactly how to make the fall look natural when Jasmine entered the center of the ballroom. A murmur rolled through the nobles. Eleanor opened her mouth again, but this time fewer faces turned kindly toward her. The distance around her widened. Then Tobias Reed stepped forward. The young footman looked as if every bone in his body wanted to run, but he remained where he was. His voice shook, yet the truth inside it did not. He confirmed what he had heard at Ravenshade Manor. Cavendish had planned to use Jasmine's absence against her. He had told Eleanor that if Jasmine remained at home, the court could be made to believe she had abandoned her duties. If she appeared at the banquet, she would be painted as unstable, resentful, and unfit for public responsibility. Either way, the plan had been the same. Remove her from sight. Remove her from influence. Then pressure Alistar until the name of Duchess became something Jasmine carried in law but not in life. Alistar flinched, not because Tobias accused him directly. That would have been easier to bear. He flinched because Tobias was revealing the shape of a trap Alistar had helped build without ever asking who would be caught inside it. Clement unfolded another paper from the packet and held it up for the royal table to see. His voice, when he spoke again, had turned cold. The missing records had not been lost in dust. They had been removed, hidden, and kept among Cavendish Jasper's private documents. The royal decree honoring Lady Seraphina Vance had been in his possession. So had notes concerning Jasmine's invitation, the change to the palace register, and the staged report of her supposed refusal to attend. Cavendish's composure finally shattered. He stepped forward, insisting the papers had been placed there by enemies. He said powerful houses often became victims of forged accusations. He claimed he had only ever acted to protect the dignity of the crown. But no one believed him now, not Clement, not Gideon, not Lady Beatrice, not even the nobles who had smiled with him earlier. Because lies lose their elegance when evidence stands beside them. Lady Beatrice rose fully from her chair. The movement silenced every whisper. She looked at Cavendish as though he were no longer an advisor, no longer a court figure, no longer a man worth polite language. She declared that any servant of the crown who hid royal records, manipulated an invitation, bribed palace staff, and attempted to remove a duchess under false claims had not protected royal dignity. He had attacked it. Cavendish's face went pale. Gideon stepped closer. Lady Beatrice gave the order with no tremor in her voice. Cavendish Jasper was to be stripped of his advisory position immediately. His seal, his access to royal correspondence, and his seat in council were revoked until a formal inquiry could be completed. Until then, he would be held under guard. The words landed like stones. Cavendish looked around the room, searching desperately for someone to intervene. No one did. Not a single noble stepped forward. The same men who had once laughed at his clever comments now avoided his gaze. The same ladies who had praised his influence now held their fans high enough to hide their faces. Power, when it begins to fall, discovers how lonely it has always been. Gideon gestured to the guards. This time they did not hesitate. They moved to Cavendish's side. He tried once more to speak, but the words were swallowed by the weight of the room. The guards took him by the arms and led him away from the royal table, past the nobles, past Eleanor, past Jasmine. For one brief moment, Cavendish's eyes met Jasmine's. There was hatred there, but there was fear too. Jasmine did not look away. She watched him pass, not with cruelty, not with triumph, but with the calm of a woman who had survived the trap meant to destroy her. Then Lady Beatrice turned to Eleanor, and the room grew colder. Eleanor stood very still, her ivory gown shining beneath the chandeliers like a beautiful lie. Without Cavendish beside her, without the nobles crowding around her, without Alistar's arm to hold, she looked suddenly exposed. Lady Beatrice did not need to shout. She simply stated that Lady Eleanor Vance had disgraced her family name, insulted a lawful duchess, interfered with royal order, and used a servant to carry out public humiliation beneath the crown's roof. Eleanor's lips parted. For once, no clever answer came. Lady Beatrice announced that Eleanor would no longer be welcome within the Queen's inner circle. Her invitations to private royal gatherings were withdrawn. Her name would be removed from the list of ladies permitted to attend intimate court functions until the crown decided otherwise. In royal society, it was not imprisonment, but for Eleanor, it was destruction. Her face crumpled for half a second before she forced it still. The women who had admired her earlier stepped farther away. No one offered a hand. No one touched her shoulder. No one whispered comfort. She had wanted Jasmine erased from the court. Instead, the court erased her. Mabel Hart was taken aside for questioning, though Jasmine quietly asked that the maid be shown mercy if her confession was complete and honest. That small act made several nobles lower their eyes again. Because even after being humiliated, Jasmine showed more grace to a servant than the court had shown her. And then at last, the room's attention returned to Alistar. No one ordered his punishment, no guard touched his arm, no decree was read against him. But shame found him all the same. It stood beside him more heavily than any sentence. He looked at the empty space where Cavendish had stood. He looked at Eleanor, ruined in the place Jasmine should have been honored from the start. He looked at the stained gown, the crown lily, the opened records, the bowed nobles, the servant who had confessed, and the wife who had endured every wound without becoming cruel. And finally, he saw the full damage of his weakness. He had told himself he was protecting his house, but he had opened the door to those who wanted to poison it. He had told himself one evening with Eleanor would calm the court, but that one evening had given liars enough room to call his wife unstable, unworthy, and removable. He had believed silence was safer than courage, but his silence had become a weapon in the hands of people who hated Jasmine. He did not only fail to protect her, he helped create the very moment others used to destroy her. That truth settled over him with unbearable force. Alistar turned toward Jasmine. The ballroom watched him, but he barely seemed aware of anyone else now. For the first time that night, he looked at her without pride, without defense, without the cold mask of a duke trying to survive the judgment of his equals. He looked at her like a man who had finally understood what he had lost. Jasmine stood only a few steps away, but the distance between them felt wider than the entire ballroom, because honor can be restored before a court. A title can be announced again. A stolen record can be returned. But trust, once abandoned in the doorway of a lonely house, does not simply walk back because regret has arrived late. And as Alistar took one slow step toward his wife, the question hanging over the royal banquet was no longer whether Jasmine belonged. The kingdom had answered that. The question was whether Jasmine could ever forgive a man who only saw her worth after the court was forced to bow. Alistar took one step toward Jasmine, then another. The sound of his boots against the marble seemed louder than the music had ever been. No one spoke. No one moved to help him. The court that had once strengthened his pride now stood around him like witnesses. Every face in the ballroom watched the Duke of Ravenshade approach the wife he had abandoned. And for the first time that night, Alistar looked as if he wished there were no title before his name at all. Because a title could command servants. A title could open palace doors. A title could make nobles bow and advisors listen. But a title could not undo the image of Jasmine standing alone in the doorway of Ravenshade Manor, while he left with another woman. And it could not erase the silence he had given her when she needed his voice most. Jasmine did not step back when he approached. She did not move toward him either. She stood still in her stained blue gown. The sapphire crown lily returned to her hand, her face calm, her eyes unreadable. The court had just bowed to her. The truth had just restored her name. The people who plotted against her had been exposed. But triumph had not made her soft, and pain had not made her cruel. That was what broke Alistar most. He stopped in front of her, close enough to see the wine dried into the silk, close enough to see the quiet exhaustion behind her strength, close enough to understand that every wound of the night had left a mark, even the ones no one else could see. For a moment he seemed unable to speak. The Duke, who had faced councils, rivals, royal pressure, and noble judgment now stood helpless before one woman's silence. Then he lowered his head, not slightly, not politely. He lowered it deeply enough for the ballroom to understand that this was not a courtly gesture. It was surrender. When Alistar finally spoke, his voice no longer carried the cold control of a man guarding his reputation. It was rough, quiet, and stripped of pride. He apologized to Jasmine before the entire court. Not as Duke to Duchess, not as Master of Ravenshade to the woman who bore his name, but as a husband who had failed the wife he should have protected. He said he had been ashamed, and the confession moved through the room with painful force. Not because Jasmine had lacked honor, not because she had ever disgraced him, not because the whispers were true. He had been ashamed because he was afraid. Afraid of the old families, afraid of noble laughter, afraid that standing beside a Black Duchess would cost him the approval of people whose respect had never been worth her tears. He admitted that he had cared more about what the court might say than what his silence was doing to the woman who lived inside his home. He admitted that he had allowed Eleanor to take a place that was never hers. He admitted that by leaving Jasmine behind, he had made it easier for others to lie about her, stain her, and try to erase her. The ballroom listened without breathing. Eleanor stood near the edge of the room, humiliated and forgotten. Cavendish was gone. Mabel was guarded. The nobles who had laughed now watched the Duke confess that his shame had not been born from Jasmine's weakness but from his own. Alistar lifted his eyes to her. He said he did not deserve forgiveness that night. He did not deserve her hand. He did not deserve to stand beside her simply because the court had finally learned who she was. But if she allowed it, he would spend every day proving that he could become the man he should have been when the carriage first waited outside their home. Jasmine listened. Her face did not crumble. Her eyes did not fill with the easy tears the court might have expected. She did not run into his arms. She did not smile for the comfort of the nobles. She did not turn her pain into a performance just because her husband had finally found the courage to name his failure. That was not Jasmine. She had been hidden too long to become desperate the moment she was seen. For a quiet moment, she looked at him, and the silence between them carried the whole story of their marriage. The lonely dinners, the closed doors, the careful distance. The way he had allowed the court's cruelty to enter their home without ever opening his mouth to stop it. Then Jasmine spoke. Her voice was soft, but every person in the room heard her. She told him that an apology could open a door, but it could not rebuild a home in one night. Alistar closed his eyes briefly, as if the words hurt because they were fair. Jasmine continued. If he wanted to stand beside her again, he would have to earn that place. Not with flowers, not with public regret, not with pretty speeches made after the truth had already saved her. He would have to earn it with courage, with honesty, with respect. He would have to defend her when no one applauded him for it. He would have to speak when silence was easier. He would have to remember that a wife was not an ornament to display when convenient or hide when society became cruel. She was his equal, and if he could not honor that in private, then he had no right to claim her in public. The words settled over the ballroom like judgment and mercy together. Alistar bowed his head again. This time, there was no pride left in him to fight the truth. Jasmine looked at him for one final breath, then turned slightly toward the royal table, making it clear that the night would not end with her falling into the arms of the man who had broken her. It would end with her standing on her own feet. The court saw it, Alistar saw it, and perhaps for the first time, he understood that forgiveness was not something a powerful man could request and receive like a royal favor. It was something a wounded woman had the right to withhold until trust learned how to breathe again. For a while, no one knew how to return to celebration. The banquet had survived scandal, confession, punishment, and truth, but the music did not begin at once. The musicians sat above the ballroom with their instruments resting quietly in their hands, as if even they understood that some silences deserved to remain untouched. Jasmine stood beneath the chandeliers, still wearing the gown they had tried to ruin. The wine stain remained, but now it no longer looked like shame. It looked like a mark of everything she had endured without bowing her head. A reminder that dignity did not always arrive spotless. Sometimes it walked through betrayal, accusation, and public cruelty, then stood in the center of the room anyway. Lady Beatrice Ashcombe looked toward the musicians and gave a small nod. At first, only one violin began, soft, careful. Then another joined it, followed by the low warmth of a cello. The music returned slowly, not with the careless joy it had carried before, but with something deeper, almost reverent. The sound moved across the ballroom like a breath being released after too much pain. Then the royal host stepped forward. All eyes turned. In a voice that carried clearly through the hall, he invited Her Grace, Jasmine Stirling, Duchess of Ravenshade, daughter of the Crown Lily line, to open the final dance. A second silence followed, not cruel this time, honoring. The same ballroom that had laughed at her now waited for her first step. Alistar stood a few feet away, his face still marked by shame. He looked at Jasmine as though asking permission to exist in the same moment with her. Slowly, carefully, he extended his hand. There was no pride in the gesture, no command, no assumption that she would accept, only a request. The court watched, breathless. Eleanor, forgotten near the edge of the room, looked away. Cavendish was gone. The nobles who had once whispered behind fans now stood quiet, witnessing a woman choose for herself in the same room where others had tried to choose her fate. Jasmine looked at Alistar's hand. Then she looked at his face. For a long moment, she did not move, and in that pause, the entire court understood something important. This was not a wife rushing back to the man who wounded her. This was not forgiveness given because the world expected a beautiful ending. This was not weakness dressed as grace. This was Jasmine deciding what would happen next. At last, she placed her hand in his. Not because the pain was gone, not because trust had returned in one night, not because his apology had erased the lonely doorway, the stolen invitation, the false letter, or the silence that had broken her heart. She placed her hand in his because the choice was finally hers. Alistar bowed over her hand, lower than court custom required. When Jasmine stepped onto the marble floor for the final dance, every eye followed her. The woman he had hidden walked beneath the royal lights. The woman he had abandoned moved with the calm of a queen. And as the music rose around her, Jasmine Vance did not look like a duchess who had stolen the night. She looked like a woman who had taken back her life. And so the night that began with shame ended with every noble eye fixed on the woman they had tried to dismiss. Jasmine had entered the palace alone, carrying pain no one could see and truth no one expected. She had been mocked, stained, accused, and nearly removed from the room as if her dignity meant nothing. But she did not beg to be accepted. She did not lower herself to match their cruelty. She stood in the light with her mother's name, her own honor, and a strength even betrayal could not destroy. Duke Alistar had brought another woman to the royal banquet because he feared the whispers of the court. But by the end of the night, those same nobles bowed before the wife he had been ashamed to claim. And as Jasmine moved through the final dance, one truth remained stronger than every lie spoken against her. A woman does not become powerful because the world finally sees her. Sometimes, she becomes powerful the moment she stops hiding for people who were never brave enough to love her properly. If this story touched your heart, subscribe for more emotional royalty stories filled with betrayal, secrets, love, and powerful endings. And tell me in the comments, would you forgive Duke Alistar after what he did, or would you walk away from Ravenshade forever?